Accordingly, it's worth bearing in mind his points, but also considering how Duhem's ideas have been extended, for example, by Quine. Duhem's Aim and Structure of Physical Theory is very worthwhile reading, while there's an interesting piece on him in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which offers quite a useful guide to some of the debate that's taken place about Duhem's work. Duhem is today often thought of in the context not so much of his own work, but of the so-called Duhem-Quine thesis. A good place to look for a formulation of this is Quine's paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, is to be found, for example, in his From a Logical Point of View. Quine's approach is explicitly pragmatist in its character, a view that Duhem himself, because of his stuff about natural classification, rejected. Much of Quine's paper is concerned with the issue of analyticity, which is not our concern here. But later, Quine discusses the relationship between theories and experience, stressing the idea that, I quote, our statements about the external world face the tribunal of sense experience, not individually, but only as a corporate body. His own epistemology, however, is spelled out in section 6 of that paper. And I quote briefly from that. The issue over there being classes seems more a question of convenient conceptual scheme. The issue over there being centaurs or brick houses on Elm Street seems more a question of facts. But, and this is continuing to quote Quine, but Quine says, I have been urging, that this difference is only one of degree, and that it turns upon our vaguely pragmatic inclination to adjust one strand of the fabric of science rather than another in accommodating some particular recalcitrant experience. Conservatism figures in such choices, and so does the quest for simplicity. Quine is explicit about the thrust of his paper being pragmatist, and knowledge for him is a matter, as he indicates, of considerations of simplicity and conservatism, as he put it in another paper, of making minimal mutilations to our existing body of knowledge. Much of Quine's argument consists of a reaction to and the development of themes in Carnap. But there is also a point in common with the American philosopher C.I. Lewis, who had argued for what he called the pragmatic a priori. That's to say, that what was to be taken within a system of our ideas as immune to revision by experience was, Lewis wanted to argue, a matter for our pragmatic decision. Quine himself in Two Dogmas mentions that it's possible in this context of accommodating experience to revise logic. And he comments, revision even of the logical law of the excluded middle has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics. And what difference is there in principle between such a shift and the shift whereby Kepler superseded Ptolemy, or Einstein, Newton, or Darwin, Aristotle? Issues opened up by Duhem clearly pose an interesting question for Popper's approach. For while at a certain level we can obviously talk about learning by conjecture and refutation, once we move to the kind of material, to the sorts of issues with which Duhem was dealing, is, as some people claim, Popper's approach fatally flawed. Does his account still work once the kind of issues that Duhem and Quine have raised are put onto the table? There are two issues here. First of all, how might Popper respond to Duhem's argument? And second, if one were to accept Duhem's argument, what is one to make of the status of our knowledge? I'll discuss these things in turn, but I'd like first to say a little about Quine. Clearly, Quine's work comes later than that of either Duhem or Popper. But the issue from Duhem from which Quine starts, and which he then develops, was well known to Popper in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, who in considering such ideas refers to Poincaré, to Duhem, and to Dingler. Popper starts with an important consequence of conventionalism. For the simplicity of the laws of nature from a conventionalist perspective, and what is held not to be open for modification becomes a product just of our decisions, not a feature of nature itself. Popper sees conventionalism, kind of approach, say, that Duhem is taking, and certainly which Quine is taking, as coherent and defensible. His difference from it relates to a difference with respect to the aims of science. At one level, this simply exhibits a difference in attitude. That's to say, what Popper might take to be empirical refutations of a well-established theory could, by a conventionalist, be blamed on inadequate knowledge of the theory or be avoided by way of the adoption of auxiliary hypotheses. That's to say, by putting in something new in place of existing subsidiary ideas which we were making use of, or by suggesting corrections should be made to our measuring instruments, or even simply through an expression of skepticism about particular experimental results which are calling our theory into question. More generally, the full range of arguments suggested by Duhem and then elaborated on by Quine would be open here to the conventionalist. Further, as Popper suggests, the conventionalist may put his or her points as criticisms of Popper. That's to say, there are all kinds of ways in which we can hold a particular claim to be true by way of making modifications to other elements of our knowledge. If this is the case, how then do we learn by conjectures and refutations? Popper's view is that the, and I quote, objections of such an imaginary conventionalist seem to be incontestable. Popper's own view is further that, and again I quote, it's impossible to decide by analyzing, I put in here just its logical form, whether a system of statements is a conventional system of irrefutable implicit definitions, or whether it is a system which is empirical in my sense, that is, a refutable system. Popper's response is that what is crucial here are the methods that we adopt towards such a system. And his specific response to conventionalism is that we should make a decision not to adopt its methods. This is a decision which isn't arbitrary, but rather one which Popper makes in the light of his preferred view as to the aims of science. That's to say, in order to avoid having something that's true simply as a consequence of the procedures that we adopt towards it, but rather, if we can here invoke the aims that Popper articulated more fully later, which is aiming to discover interesting truths about a world seen as existing independently of ourselves. What does all this amount to? Essentially, it's a matter of adopting methodological rules which are geared towards claiming a lot about the world. Popper's ideas on this seem to me to be first most fully spelled out in the material from Conjectures, which we were looking at last time. We then need, once we've been through those things, then to put our ideas to the test, and then in the event of the test going against the theory, to make modifications to the theory or to auxiliary hypotheses, an approach which could clearly be extended to covering the full range of possibilities raised by Quine. That's to say, for Popper, you can make modifications. However, for Popper, as we saw last time, one needs to do so in ways that increase rather than decrease the content of what you are asserting, and thus the content and the testability of one's theoretical system. What all this means is that Popper not only knew about the conventionalist approach to science, but he developed the most significant part of his epistemology in the course of developing a response to it. Popper didn't deny that one could be a conventionalist if one wished to be a conventionalist, but he argued that it was perfectly reasonable to set out to be a realist, and that if one made that choice, one would adopt different methodological rules from those that, say, Quine was later to defend. Also, as I've indicated, given that Popper's choice was made with reference to our aims as being realist and fallibilist, it is well worth asking if someone with Quine takes a conventionalist approach, if they take a pragmatist approach, is there not something odd about their then treating the consequences that follows from such an approach as if they give us, albeit tentatively, a realist understanding of the world, which might tentatively be made use of for explanatory purposes? That's to say, if there is a difference between the products which you'll get to by following one set of methodological rules as opposed to another, and Popper is advocating choosing one of these because it seems to be the kind of approach that makes most sense if you want to aim towards a realist understanding, then it would seem a bit strange, unless Popper's got this choice totally wrong, to take the non-realist or the conventionalist path, but then nonetheless to treat what one gets to as if it was aspiring to give us realistic understanding of the world. I should elaborate on this briefly. Popper's argument that different methodological approaches are possible and that we need to consider the kind of consequences which will follow from these different methodological approaches and to make a choice between them in the light of our view as to the desirability of these different consequences, where if these things are articulated as metaphysical claims about the world, we might also obviously be able to assess them as we can different claims about the aims of science by means of critical arguments of the sort that Popper developed about how one could engage in the critical appraisal of metaphysical ideas. Popper makes his choice because he's attracted to and finds cogent what I have called aspirational realism. That's to say, the idea that we are aiming for realist truth about the world, although we may or may not have reached it in any particular theory that we take up. But if people adopt other methodological approaches, it might be useful to ask them to spell out both what these are and to discuss with them what kind of epistemological products they're likely to lead to. One might ask, for example, if someone favors a conventionalist approach, what kind of understanding of the products of scientific activity this is likely to lead to? And is it something the desirability of which as an aim they are able to defend. In addition, people may be found espousing a conventionalist methodology, but favoring some kind of realist view of the aims or aspirations of science. But one might there ask, well, does this kind of combination actually make sense? And I'm not saying here that there's an absolutely knockdown argument against it. It seems to me that it's here where one can usefully enter critical discussion with them about these things. Indeed, one could cogently take such a view if one had some kind of independent argument to the effect that the world was, as a matter of fact, simple in the relevant sense. But it's not clear where such an argument would come from. After all, we noted a certain awkwardness in invoking ideas about simplicity, even in connection with the problems concerning Goodmanesque predicates, which we discussed in an earlier lecture. But there's more to this. For it seems to me that, other than in settings in which our problem is itself concerned with simplicity determined by convention, critical rationalists should actually reject the idea of Occam's razor. That is, the idea that we should minimize the number of entities that we postulate to exist. I would stress that this is simply my own personal opinion, and I'll be delighted to hear in the discussion period if and why I'm wrong about this. Why do I take this view? Well, for the critical rationalist, what matters is explanatory value and testability, rather than economy in terms of the kinds of entities that we invoke. And also for the critical rationalist, it matters that what we're invoking makes sense as metaphysics if we're making use in the background of a particular metaphysical research program. And also, there need to be ways of assessing the adequacy of the theories we're working with as solutions to our problems. After all, someone might insist that the mind-body problem should be understood simply in terms of movements of physical things as described by physics. This, to be sure, would minimize on the number of entities that you're invoking, but there seems to me no reason whatever why, assuming simplicity of entities in this sense, should actually be true of the world. That's to say, unless, as it were, God himself had assured you that when he created the universe, he did it on the basis of the simplest possible number of entities, and that his view of simplicity also fitted our own intuitive ideas on that topic, there would seem no reason whatever to think that the world should fit what Occam's razor would lead us to. I raise this with a certain amount of trepidation because there is a point where Popper himself invokes Occam's razor, but if this little bit of argument is right, I think that he was mistaken in taking it on board at all. Of course, if you're not a realist and take the view that human knowledge consists simply of what seems to us to be the simplest way of arranging things, the simplest way of categorizing our knowledge, the easiest way of arranging things, say, to make predictions, then Occam's razor looks to me a useful tool. But I would have thought that there is every reason not to be a conventionalist with regard to our knowledge. And on those grounds, I would favor the rejection of Occam's razor. Problems about theory, selection, and simplicity might still arise. But it seems to me that for the realist, these things have to be addressed as an issue in tentative metaphysics or tackled by way of methodology rather than by assuming that we can make use of Occam's razor. Popper argued that there were advantages to taking a realist view. His argument about this was somewhat muted in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, but much more strongly in his later work. But that clearly, to take such a view was a matter of choice. If one wished to be a realist in Popper's distinctive sense, what was involved was having realism as an aim for science, and this is something that we might aspire to attain in our scientific knowledge, not some theory, as sometimes happens with contemporary realists, to the effect that one's terms refer. For if one's theory is false, what they refer to may well not actually exist, but the theory may itself be a realist theory, but a false realist theory. Just in the sense, say, that a particular theory which we favor and which postulates the existence of entities of a particular kind may well turn out to be false. We will return to what is involved in all this in a later lecture. For Imre Lakatos, in his development of what started as a Popperian response to Thomas Kuhn, turned back in some ways in the direction of conventionalism. In that context, he developed various criticisms of Popper, albeit, as I've already mentioned in an earlier lecture, in ways that I think try to make use of Popper's own ideas against him. A useful account as to how, in broad terms, Popper responds to these sorts of criticisms and to issues raised by Duhem and then subsequently in Quine's work, you can see in section 8 of his replies to my critics in the Schilp edited volume, The Philosophy of Karl Popper. Now, I'm going to turn to an additional issue, because assiduous readers of Popper, or people who've looked at the critical discussion of his work, might say, well, what about what Popper has to say about the so-called rationality principle? Doesn't he actually advocate what amounts to taking a conventionalist approach towards the status of that? Let me explain. All that I've said so far, I hope, has been straightforward. It may well be wrong, but I hope it's relatively straightforward. But there's a possible complication. It's posed by material in Popper's paper, Models, Instruments, and Truth. The paper was based on a talk given by Popper in the Department of Economics at Harvard in 1963. An extract from a revised version of the paper was published in French under the title, and here I give only the English, Rationality and the Status of the Rationality Principle, in a Festschrift in 1967. And a copy of this material, from which the French translation was made, circulated in English in the LSE Department of Philosophy. And so people who visited there or were interested in Popper's work and were able to get a copy were able to refer to this before it was later published in the full lecture in the book, The Myth of the Framework. In Popper's view, one can make use of the same structure for explanation, which I discussed in an earlier lecture in connection with the natural sciences, in respect of history and the social sciences. Although if you're interested on this, look also at Popper's historical explanation, an interview in the collection of Popper's papers after the Open Society, and also Popper's discussions in the introductory material to the book version of The Poverty of Historicism, and his discussion of issues to do with the poverty of historicism in Unended Quest. The idea is that one postulates that people act rationally in the situations in which they find themselves, where this rationality principle then plays the same role in our explanations as do substantive laws in the natural sciences. Just what is involved in this paper of Popper's seems to me a little murky. do particularly look at sections 12 and 13 of the paper, because he goes over a number of things, some of which I think are a bit contentious, really quite quickly. One of the questions that one can ask about concerning Popper's lecture is he claiming that people act rationally in relation to the situation that they were actually in, or in relation to how they understood the situation that they were in, which might involve a misunderstanding of that situation? It's interesting for me to look back at this, because this paper was prepared for inclusion into a collection of essays when I was working with Popper, and I had some discussions with him about this, some material from which is included in note 19 on page 183 in The Myth of the Framework. And what we got on to discussing there was, when you're talking about the situation, are you talking about the situation as it was, or as the agent who was acting took it to be, or as they could have taken it to be? Because there may be cases in which people's knowledge was limited, so that there was no way in which they could discover what was actually going on. And my own view in retrospect about this is that the paper might have been, or the end part of the paper where these problems arise, might have benefited if it had been systematically reworked in the light of these distinctions to make it clear just exactly what Popper was referring to at the different points. In addition, one might ask, just what is it to act rationally? Does this involve getting the best outcome that one possibly could in the situation that one was in? But what, for example, about the time and so on that it would take to work out what the best outcome would be? Or wouldn't an idea like the economist Herbert Simon's notion of satisfying here be sufficient? What is this? Well, would people acting in such a way that what they did was okay be enough? I mean, suppose you are sent out with the task of buying ice cream for a children's party. Suppose that you are lucky enough to be in a giant American supermarket where there are entire aisles of different sorts of ice cream in different colors and flavors and so on. Is the rational course of action one where you actually sort of find out information about all the options and then work out which would be the best? Or would it be good enough to say, well, kids typically don't necessarily like ice cream with lumps in it, and they quite often don't like stuff with strong flavors. So maybe the best course of action is to find the first reasonable looking vanilla ice cream that you come across and go off with that. And the issue really is, well, what is involved in acting rationally? Just how much of possible knowledge is it reasonable for you to go with? If you take a view that's in line with Simon's ideas, it would mean, for example, that they could equally well have done other things than what they did, and their action would still have counted as being rational in this rather weaker sense. Popper's discussion is interesting in that he works with an idea of rationality, so that it's not necessarily the case that all our actions are rational. He gives the example, and you might have come across, you might indeed have been in a car with someone when they were doing this, that they might have been persisting to try to park a car in a space that is obviously too small for it to fit in. And Popper is saying, look, we know perfectly well that we don't always behave rationally. What, however, is striking is that Popper argues that if we encounter such a situation, one in which our rational analysis is falsified, we should, in effect, by convention, retain the principle that people are acting rationally and make changes to other parts of our model, rather than giving up on it, even though he admits that in such cases the rationality principle could well be false. This might seem to suggest that conventionalism is involved, and indeed, it's been commented, I think, by Alan Musgrave that there's a parallel between this and some of Lakatos's later conventionalist-influenced ideas. But I suspect myself that there are two slightly different issues involved. The first is that, as Popper indicates in this footnote I've already referred to in the Method of the Framework, that it might be important to clarify at various points in the lecture just what notion of the rationality principle and the situation he's actually working with. For, as he explains in the note, different things might be meant by it, and I've mentioned this already. The other issue is that what Popper is taking the alternatives to using the rationality principle to be might be worth considering here. It's striking that for Popper, after his interest shifted in his relatively early years from working in psychology to philosophy, he seemed to have something of an aversion to making use of psychological theories in an explanatory role in social science. In some cases, this may be understandable enough, but I wonder if Popper may have been a bit too sweeping here. And on the face of it, a testable psychological theory might be fully compatible with the rationality principle, as serving to explain how people took the situation to be in which they were acting in a subjectively but not an objectively rational way. That's to say, you might have psychological theories which can throw light on why it is that people misunderstood what the situation was objectively within which they were acting. For example, there's been a long-running controversy in economics as to whether or not it is fruitful to make use of so-called behavioral theories of the firm, rather than, say, simply making use of an oversimplifying assumption that those in charge of a firm simply try to maximize their profits. And so you seem to have a choice here between the more traditional approach, which just takes firms as profit maximizing, and other people saying, no, what you need to do is to discover in more detail who was performing what kind of action and on what basis in the firm, and where some of what they're doing might be material that's illuminated by different particular, say, psychological theories. On the face of it, there would seem to me to be nothing wrong in principle to offer testable theories of this kind, which indeed themselves assume that people are acting rationally on the basis of the motives that it's being conjectured that they have. Similarly, there is a literature in economics on so-called preference reversal. That's to say, in certain circumstances, there seems to be a well-corroborated psychological hypothesis that people are not transitive in respect of their preferences in the way in which economists have standardly assumed them to be. It's a little bit like as if in certain particular circumstances, they preferred A to B and B to C, but then didn't do the expected thing in terms of the relationship between A and C. And the question is, if there is evidence of this kind, and there were theoretical ideas behind it rather than just an empirical result, is this stuff which people should be making use of if they are interested in doing explanations in economics. Personally, as with the Herbert Simon approach to which I referred earlier, I can't see anything wrong with such approaches or why we should maintain the correctness of a strong sense of the rationality principle in the face of them, provided indeed that theories of these kinds are testable, and also, and I think this is possibly a crucial point, that they offer interesting explanations of the phenomena in which we're interested. And there, I think, may be the place that a problem arises. For while it looks to me as if the preference reversals, the significance of which in certain circumstances, which are being stressed, there seems to be good evidence that they're there. What's not so clear is whether the modification of our theories to take account of this really is helpful in terms of explanations. That's to say, we can ask, are there real-world phenomena which we're trying to explain, which if we made the appropriate modifications, we could explain better than we do now? This, however, would involve us, if we follow up on it, in discussions about trade-offs between using very simple and general models in the social sciences and others which are less general, but which simplify less. And there is a kind of discussion that's taken place amongst some economists interested in the methodology of economics as to whether we really should be committed to using very simple models of rational action, or whether it wouldn't be better if we used a whole typology of different models about how people act in different kinds of circumstances. And clearly, if using this whole variety of models is just ad hoc, then there's a problem about it. But I don't see myself why we should stick just to one single oversimplifying model. I mean, one might, but this is a slightly wild hypothesis here, say, well, consider what happens in chemistry. Someone could surely come along and say, look, we just need to assume one very simple model of an atom rather than having all of these different ones. You say, well, it's, you know, there are problems about that. They said, yes, but it is a single, simple, testable approach. Or the other way around, you could say, well, given that we allow for many different models of atoms in chemistry, is there any reason for insisting on one very simple model of human motivation in other areas of the social sciences, for example, in economics, which in the face of this problem, certainly some economists have done. But to ask this is to get us into questions even further removed from Popper's writings than we've already taken us in this appendix, and so must be postponed for discussion on some other occasion. I'll call a halt here and move over to discussion. Please indicate, I think that I can see everyone, so if you want to pose a question or to raise an objection, you can get through to me simply by waving your hand, or if you're a dab hand at this, putting your electronic hand up. Hassan, do unmute yourself and have a go at me.
Yeah, many thanks, Jeremy. I appreciate it. I have one little clarification question. You said you mentioned the term aspirational realism.
Yes.
You said this is your term. Popper himself used conjectural realism.
I am not quite sure, but I've suggested aspirational just to emphasize very strongly that it is stuff which we are striving towards.
Didn't you use this term external realism?
Well, I mean, it certainly is. I mean, in Popper, there is realism about the external world, and there is also, I mean, just in the sense that he thinks that there is a world there with people and cats and tables and chairs and so on in it, and also he commends to us the idea that we should try and get, we should strive for physical theories which can give us a realistic representation of things. And so he put in a lot of work, for example, on issues to do with the arrow of time, and also on issues to do with quantum theory, to try to see if he could offer a realist interpretation of theories which seemed not to be realist, although they were empirically very successful. And I mean, I don't think in the end that Popper was was successful in this, but I think that he offered reasonable arguments for trying it. Okay.
Okay.
Ulrich, you have a question. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, Jeremy, thanks a lot for this very nice lecture again. So I have a question and a comment connected, and I sort of tried to formulate it. So let me read it from what I put. Let me start with the comment and the question to you. So in my practical research and experience and investigation of quite complex phenomena like the Earth system, climate, and impacts on public health, but also in theory, I'm not a philosopher, but a practicing natural scientist. I see no problem in consistently applying both critical rationalism according to Popper, as far as I understand it, and Occam's razor. So to me, simplicity can be regarded as a secondary but still valid criterion, as was nicely formulated also by Einstein and is really widely and successfully followed in modern science, that simply everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? And so in practice, in other words, to me, it's simply if you have multiple ways of explaining something, meaning all available evidence, all observations, but also answering all currently, if in Popper's sense, it's about problem solving and in addressing and answering all currently relevant problems and questions, then simply you would naturally take the simplest version because that's most efficient in applying in problem solving, which was also Popper's goal, right? And so in that sense, but that's only as long as this holds true that this simplest theory also does the job it's supposed to do. And as soon as anybody is able to refute the simple theory, of course, you go to the next more complex one. And of course, this applies not only to what you observe, but also then to the questions you may pose that go even further, right? But as long as you cannot refute the other theory, I don't see a problem or show that the other one is indeed mightier and better as it explains more. I see no problem of applying this simplicity argument of Occam's razor. And so I'm wondering, probably you thought about all that already, but maybe I have a different experience in dealing with it from my side. So if you listen to me and all the things you know, do you still see a problem there, or could it just not be an issue? And Popper was maybe right in adopting Occam's razor, maybe here or there, as you pointed out, which I didn't know.
Thank you for the question. I suspect the difference between us is that you know what you're talking about and I don't. However, having said that, I guess I'd answer in three parts. First of all, with regard to Einstein, I mean, bear in mind his objections to quantum theory, where he said, really, look, God doesn't play dice. And so he seems to me to have been someone who was interested in the truth about the world, but also thought, I would be inclined to say, as a matter of metaphysical belief, that the world had been designed in a simple way. I think that that is a rather different matter from simply economizing on entities. The second point that I'd make is this. Popper himself thought that, I mean, he noted that lots of people had talked about the significance of simplicity in relation to the choice of scientific hypotheses. And he himself had arguments that actually testability gave you a key notion which you could make use of as a way of cashing out simplicity. The underlying problem for me would really be that it's a matter of how you weigh up different things. I mean, take my example of something which in reality, such as I was conjecturing the mind-body problem might be. I mean, if you thought that Descartes was onto something, then the motions that I've been going through in these lectures would be a product between the interaction of different entities, physical ones and non-physical ones. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. However, if it were the case that Descartes in this respect was correct, it would still in principle be possible simply to say, I'm not going to have anything to do with these non-physical entities. I will simply formulate complicated, testable laws which set out to capture everything in terms of what is taken to be purely physical behavior. And I guess that the issue that I'm raising is, should we invoke Occam's razor to rule out a possible proliferation of entities? And I guess that the argument that I'm attempting to offer is, well, it's not clear really why one should. Mm-hmm. That provided that what you're putting forward are testable hypotheses, or if you're operating with things that, while not testable, make some kind of sense in the way in which the alternatives don't, then I don't see any reason why we should be pushed towards a minimization of entities. I mean, let me offer you another analogy here. I did some work at one point on people who were interested in opposing Darwinism and the ideas of so-called intelligent design instead. And I had a look at the work of someone who's made quite a lot of running in this. And he offered in the end a picture where there were certain things to be found in biology, where he just couldn't see that there could be an evolutionary path to the production of these things. And so he said, I think then evolutionary theory is wrong. But in thinking about this, I was left with the situation where it seemed to me that he was offering us a picture where evolutionary theory was kind of all right in terms of explaining everything else, other than a few things for which there didn't seem to be any particular point other than as things stood, we seem to have no explanation for them. And at that level, it seemed to me that one might be able to fold such a program of research by saying, well, look, the picture that you're giving, I mean, you may be perfectly right that this is currently an unexplained problem, although these are pretty much ubiquitous in science. But at the same time, to seriously propose the idea that we have material which developed as evolutionary theory would put it forward, other than one or two kind of random bits of pointless design, would seem to make no sense at all. And so it seems to me that it's these substantive things, rather than just arguing on the basis of simplicity, that one might reasonably have recourse to.
Yeah, maybe if I may follow up just very briefly, I'm fully with you that I think just simplicity in itself cannot be anything. And that actually also goes back to your first point about Einstein and so on, right? Because clearly on that part that quantum mechanics works, I mean, again, that doesn't mean it's the truth, but it simply works and it helps solving problems. I mean, we all wouldn't have any smartphone or any phone if it didn't work, right? It's all based on quantum effects. All our daily life nowadays, also that we can talk to each other. So simply this was proven that you need this and you can make it work. So again, I think indeed, like you said, I think Occam's razor or any simplicity argument should never be used to rule out for the future in a fundamental aspiration for truth any other theories, right? But as long as I can do with a relatively simple and compact theory, again, that is not refuted, of course, right? And doesn't have to be extended in order to explain something else successfully, I would still argue, when carefully phrased, and I don't know the exact wordings of Occam's razor, I think when it's carefully phrased, this simplicity argument is a valuable one. And one last comment and question to you, maybe also for the future. I'm still sort of seeking for ways in making Popper and critical rationalism in general more popular and more practically applied, both in science, as I'm practicing with my colleagues, but also in society. I think that unifies many of us, right? And I think one way of doing it is trying to sort of minimize all kinds of ruling out or playing Occam's razor against Popper's approach or whatever, but sort of showing how things, the reasonable things, actually in the end go together. But I hope that we can sort of follow up on that, because that I think would help. Many scientists really like Occam's razor, which doesn't make it necessarily true or a good method, but in practice they like it so much because in practice it really helps you advancing science. But again, I don't see any, if you interpret it carefully, I don't see any real hard clash with Popper and critical rationalism. But anyhow.
Thanks very much. I've got some other people indicating they want to come in. Can they wave a hand around if they want to come in on this topic? Okay, Carlos on this topic, and then I've got Margareta and John. Okay, and Margareta, is it on this one as well? Yes, okay, well, I've called on Carlos first and then Margareta. Carlos, can you unmute yourself and come in?
Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Jeremy, for your talk. Now, two minor points, but let me tell you that I am very nervous when people use the term simplicity, okay? I don't know really what scientism means or try to indicate by using the term simplicity, okay? And you have the same problem with philosophers until today, okay? Because you can talk about notational simplicity, conceptual simplicity, mathematical simplicity, ontological simplicity, and so on. So for me, it's very difficult, okay, to follow an argument without clarifying a little bit how somebody is going to use the word simplicity, because it's a tricky word, okay? And my second point is that I find very interesting your examination of Quine's ideas and Popper's ideas, okay? I am still working on that subject myself. And I just want to share with you and other people the similarity that you can find between Popper's idea and Quine ideas, okay, beside other very strong difference. And I would like to just to read a paragraph from a paper by Quine called Naturalism or Living with Our Own Means. And he said, still the deduction and checking of observation categoricals is the essence, surely, of the experimental method, the hypothetical didactic method, the method, in Popper's words, of conjecture and refutation. It brings out that prediction of observable events is the ultimate test of scientific theory. And it's, for me, very interesting to realize how Quine is so sympathetic in this paper and in other about the use of Popper didactic ideas of the way we organize theories and the way we test them, okay? And I just want to share with you and the other people this point about Quine and Popper on scientific method.
Thanks very much. I would be inclined to say on that that might be an interesting paper for the next Popper conference, possibly Carlos, but I should leave you then. Now, Margareta wanted to come in on this same issue.
Yes, I was considering, since we mentioned Occam's razor, a Kuhnian aha exercise, and the aha that I developed was by actually applying Popper's three-world hypothesis here. So, Jeremy, I do understand there is an Occam's razor that you count the number of things, but you can also think of Occam's razor in terms of a cognitive economy. And that is the work of Nicholas Rescher that was helpful for me. So then a theory that is easy to cognitively process gives an evolutionary advantage to the community working with that theory, because they spend less sugar and all sorts of other necessary biochemical molecules while they're thinking about how to make decisions in their environment. And so Ulrich, I personally think this, if you separate world 2 from world 1 and world 3, that there is somehow now an argument for Occam's razor, but it's not maybe Occam's razor in the traditional meaning, and it may be also consistent more than with aspirational realism as Jeremy introduces this concept. And so then I maybe want to make this a segue. My other question was going to be about more clarification about aspirational realism.
Can we take that and can we come back to you on that one?
Yes.
Just put you in the list. I would like to make a brief response to yourself and to Ulrich, just in the following terms. Look, it's certainly the case that if we are making use of hypotheses, particularly for practical purposes, then there may be advantages to making use of things that are simple rather than complex. It's also the case that there may be good rules of thumb on an evolutionary basis such that people under many circumstances would have prospered. I mean, one can well imagine that a small tribe which was particularly good at hunting, rather than going to the difficulty of actually chasing down animals with big fangs and so on, might have thought, well, there's that small group of people over the hill who actually look kind of nice and pink and really have fingernails rather than claws. Why don't we just eat them instead? Now, I mean, certainly there may be practical advantages of doing things, but in other areas, we may be interested in what is actually true. And what I'd say in this context is that on the mind-body problem, one of the most contentious aspects of Popper's approach is that he wants to suggest that we should work with the hypothesis that the physical world is causally open to non-physical influences. And this is something which typically, I think, has been seen as completely unacceptable by most other people working in the philosophy of mind who take the physical sciences seriously. Now, it seems to me that in principle, we shouldn't take there to be any problem about working with different competing hypotheses. I mean, obviously, in the area of the philosophy of mind, or certainly so it seems to me, there just aren't, there's nothing around which looks particularly good. I mean, if you stick to the closure of the physical world, you're either stuck with a view under which psychological experiences and things of that sort don't exist, or where somehow they do exist, but can have had no causal impact on the development of mankind. On the other side of it, it is obviously a heroic assumption, as it were, to suggest that in understanding what's going on in the physical world, we have to work with some things that are different, quite different, and not just looking like small modifications to our existing physical theories. And it just seems to me that it's in these kinds of cases where we have to be careful about making an assumption that entities shouldn't be multiplied. What would then, I take Ulrich's point, and I would agree completely in terms of how we get on in practical terms. I take his point perfectly well in terms of possible evolutionary considerations that Margareta was raising, but where I would want to say, well, okay, if you are evoking notions of simplicity which differ from what you'd get by stressing testability, just what is going on, and how are you avoiding a non-realist view of things? Now, I mean, it's possible that someone might want to say, well, realism would be nice, but I simply can't see, certainly at the moment, any way in which we could develop a realist theory. Another whole problem, and I kind of waved my hands at this at the end of the talk, was that you have the difficulty that if you're using models, there is the question of how much oversimplification is legitimate and how should decisions about that be made. So in this, I'm not saying the whole thing is simple and clear cut. I guess what I'm saying is, well, I think that things get messy and complicated, but I'd be inclined to say, well, if we're bringing in our ideas of simplicity, are we actually avoiding conventionalism? Do we have any reason to suppose that the world is in fact simple in those sorts of senses? But I think you're raising real and contentful points there.
May I just very briefly, Jeremy, to both you and to Carlos, because indeed, so again, I'm fully with you, and I'm not, so I think at this edge of mind, body issues and so on, and that's not the kind of simplicity that I'm talking about here, right? And I agree that this should not be used to discard interesting thoughts and whatever, right? And making things. But I give you, Carlos, to you, I give a very concrete example, right? So in climate models, you need literally hundreds of variables and parameters and input things, right? And really sort of fundamental physico-chemical constants as far as they are. Some of them are really constant. And you need equations that describe how trees are taking up carbon and respiring it and so on. And then is always the question, how much of it do you need to explain what we saw the past millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years? And how much do you need to then do a decent prediction or sensitivity run for the future? And if you were not to apply some kind of simplicity criterion, you would always be, you would make zero progress essentially, because always somebody could come along and could say, yes, but as long as you are not considering this, which could make a difference or so, you must not progress and so on. So you would have no criterion to say, okay, these things for now, I don't need to consider, and the others I do need to consider. So I think some kind, and in practice, when you are doing real scientific research, natural science research, it becomes very self-evident what kind of simplicity you strive for. But again, I agree that in the bigger philosophical framework, it's more complex to do that. But in practical work, without some kind of simplicity criterion, you could essentially abandon and forget all of natural science nowadays. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much.
Okay, Carlos, and then I'll comment on this. John, can I just check? I've got you on the list. Is yours a different point, or is it on this as well? Okay.
It's about conventionalism.
Okay, well, look, let's come back to that, because I've got two lists. I've got this conversation, and then if we come to conventionalism. Okay.
So should I ask about conventionalism?
No.
Okay.
Can we just
sure. Okay.
Simplicity
Yeah. Let's do the simplicity
and then
first.
come to you. And Margareta has also indicated that she wants also wants to get in. So, Carlos, if you just come back at Ulrich.
Yeah. Okay. Just to give a short answer to Ulrich. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Okay. Okay. So I just want to tell you that in order to understand what you are saying, but not now, but probably we can email each other. I am working with a physicist in Chile, and he's talking also about models. Okay, but he has some problem, because now you have to take a position how you are going to interpret models, fictions, theory of model, or you're going to be a little bit more approaching a realist understanding of model. And when you answer, unless you answer to that previous question, it's difficult to answer what do you mean by simplicity when you are using models, okay? Because models is another trick word.
What are you referring to, Carlos? The word didn't come over clearly. When you're talking about just the word, is it moral? Models?
Models, I'm sorry, models, M-O-D-E-R-L, models. How do you pronounce that?
Yes.
M-O.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay,
that's
I'm sorry.
fine. No. It's the record.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I am very happy somebody correct my pronunciation. No problem. So I hope Ulrich understood what I was saying.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so just very briefly, and then we should really follow up offline and by email. But the point is, in this one example that I just gave to you, this simplicity is simply that you have a sufficient, but not more than sufficient number of equations. And again, these are hundreds of equations and input parameters like the Planck constant and this constant and that constant, the electron charge, whatever. And then and you could always say, okay, but now I argue that the fish breathing, a whale breathing somewhere over there, or the butterfly in Tokyo will make the hurricane there. And you can always make things more complex and more complex. And while you need to remain open to such things, you wouldn't get anywhere with these climate models, which are numerical, mathematical models, if you wouldn't say, okay, but for now, we use the ones that can explain everything that we see and can give a decent tentative answer to the questions that we pose. And of those, we take for now the simplest one, but always remain open to make it more complex, to look at every butterfly on the planet or so. But it is becoming increasingly difficult.
But can't one there simply invoke the issue as to whether bringing in the other factor that people wanted to invoke made a significant testable difference? I mean, I'd come back to the example that I was talking about concerning this preference reversal in rather strange circumstances, where it seems to me that a perfectly respectable response to that by an economist would be to say, look, I am working here with oversimplifying models. It is not clear to me that if I make the kind of modification that you're suggesting, there is going to be any possible benefit in terms of better explanatory power. It might be the case, and my recollection is that these issues typically came up when people were estimating issues of chance or matters to do with gambling. They might be able to say, look, if we are dealing with certain very specific problems, not our general one, if you can there argue that taking account of these things would make a difference from the point of view of explanation of the phenomena that we're interested in, then we're perfectly happy to bring them in. But I guess what I'm saying is, if that line of argument works, what is doing the work is considerations of what we're trying to explain and testability rather, I think, than Occam's razor as such. But I defer again to you because once again, as I said, as soon as you posed your question, the crucial difference in this respect is that in these matters, you know what you're talking about and I don't. But anyway, thank you so much.
Jeremy, let me just one last short comment again to just endorse what you said, right? So, but this is actually taking place as we progress. So, for example, in the climate models, you are including economic models, right? You are connecting them, but always then trying to go as far as you can justify by better testability and predictability and so on. So I think we are all on the same page here, and the question is just the semantics in the end. Mm-hmm. So but thanks a lot.
Then perhaps I would like to give a comment, because once you bring in the economic models, and that's something that John Sodino might also have something to say about, you deal with a different beast than just pure climate, because it's about human behavior. And as you know, today, society is literally divided about whether capitalism is a good model or a bad model. So there is lots of cognitive dissonance that needs to be worked through. And and so I think it's not just about it's more complex or it's more simple. If I may make a sales pitch, I think it's about Popper's three-world hypothesis that say we all started in the wrong way. It's pluralism and not non-reductive materialism. And now I rest my case.
Okay, could I go over to John now, unless someone wants immediately to take you up on that? John, can you unmute?
Well, yes, I'm unmuted. Well, I'll just segue right from all of those things. Yeah. Yes, I would say that the economics, of course, it's different than the climate science, but it's also very complex and relies on simplifying models, of course. Yeah. And to get back to simplicity, sort of, yeah, it's not a. This is kind of where we started at the beginning, Jeremy, talking about that you mentioned that Popper's idea of simplicity was to create something that lends itself to empirical testing, and that, I think that's part of his opposition to conventionalism. I think it's also not untrivial that Duhem was a Catholic theologian, as you say, because obviously he's got a certain idea that he wants to eliminate the notion of external realism or realism in science to a certain extent. It kind of reminded me a bit of Bishop Berkeley or Ghazali in the Islamic tradition. This idea of obliterating objects and obliterating the natural laws and all those sorts of things, because a conventionalist structure can really, it's sort of just a construct that is made to be always true. Yeah. So there's always an ad hoc thing to make the theory true, or denying of the measurement, etc. And I think Popper's one of his most important contributions is to show that this is not what science is about. And apply this to economics. You see a lot of economists come up with their very reductive theories about how the economy is supposed to work, and they eschew the necessary empirical testing of their theories. It seems to me that Popper is right to be against this. He also rejected it in terms of Ernst Mach, because he thought his monism was reversion back to idealism. Yeah. So if you're going to make science about the real world, which is the world that is in a state of flux out there, and not the Platonic ideas that are in some mystical supersensory world, then you're going to have to deal always with the constant presence of critical empirical tests. And to me, that's what Popper's about. Yeah.
You've raised a whole bunch of things there. Can I take them in turn? First of all, I am not sure with regard to this material that there is a significant difference between the economic and models and the physics models. I mean, for example, suppose people are interested in explaining what is going on in the solar system, someone might work with a kind of rather basic Newtonian model in which the mass of each planet is taken as being located in its center. Someone could come along and say, well, this isn't strictly true. To which the answer is surely, well, that's right. But what you would need to do is to show that in relation to the explanatory problem that is facing us, making that change would be significant. Now, I mean, clearly, there are going to be some practical purposes for which someone could say, but that is impossible. I mean, doing what you're wanting would then mean that I need to take on my small ship in order, rather than being able to do simple astronomical calculations, I would need an absolutely massive computer to do. But if we're interested really just in the explanatory problem, it may be the case that something is in fact true, but where the claim is bringing in that qualification isn't relevant for our explanatory purposes, but that is a claim which on the face of it can be tested. So that going back to Ulrich, if the guy who wants to go on about butterflies in Tokyo, I mean, you can say to him, look, at one level, you're absolutely right, but at another level, can you actually offer us a testable model invoking this, where this really makes a useful difference in terms of what we're trying to explain? The second issue is in simplicity and testability. I mean, Popper tries to argue in The Logic of Scientific Discovery that basically people have said that a notion of simplicity is something that we need, and Popper set out to argue that testability can handle all the things that are relevant for this. My feeling is that he gets a long way with it, but that there are other issues about simplicity, which it's not clear that he is able to deal with in quite that way. And Nick Maxwell, for example, has endlessly gone on about there being a need to make assumptions, metaphysical ones, almost in the path of Einstein, that the world is simple, so as to dismiss various perfectly testable but grotesquely complex theories. And all I'd say is that is an area where there is still a fair bit of debate. The next thing was this. Duhem was in some senses a realist because he believed in this notion of natural classification. Another issue is, look, it is open to someone to pursue as a research program pretty much whatever metaphysics or other approach seems to them to be attractive. What I think they have to do is that if they're coming along and are wanting to take issue with the sorts of ideas that other people are working with, they, and like, for example, the intelligent design people dismissing Darwinism, one has to say to them, okay, look, I can understand the religious reasons why you're attracted to another approach, but would you mind telling us how you're suggesting we should set out to explain the kind of things which currently Darwinian approaches seem to offer us very good explanations for? And so it's not a matter of just throwing people out of the door so much as saying, no, look, come in, but understand what the problem situation is that you're facing. Have you any idea how you're going to address it? And if you haven't, then, as it were, we note that this is something that someone might pursue, but until you've done a lot of work on it, until you've got somewhere, we can't really, we're not really very willing to give you very much time. I mean, you can point out, if we don't know them already, that there are respects in which our current explanations of things aren't particularly good, and that could be very valuable, but just simply telling us what your research program is without explaining how it's to be developed into an alternative to our existing ones, that doesn't really seem to be very useful. Now, anyone else? Or have you ground to a halt, or have you had enough? Just wave your hand or put up an electronic hand if you want to come in. Hassan, and then Margareta. So Hassan first, then Margareta.
I wanted to add a point to this discussion of simplicity and back to the conventionalism. If we think about the, as you mentioned, Jeremy, about the aim of science, if we think about that, within the natural sciences, those scientists like Ulrich and others who are working as real scientists at the moment, in many cases, what they have as the aim of science in their mind is just prediction, and sometimes even just technology, just having some applications. And in those cases, because I think explanation would be a secondary desideratum for them, as opposed to prediction, then simplicity is just a tool, as Ulrich explained. And then here, in fact, this was a comment that we have to make this distinction between explanatory power and predictive power of theories. And when it comes to predictive power, simplicity is much more important than when you are thinking about explanatory power of theories. And then I have a question that when we think about conventionalism, as I want to clarify my understanding of it, is simplicity the aim for conventionalism, or as something like Occam's razor, a tool to reach at some sort of understanding reality?
Well, it seems to me the big question, the question in all of this are the following. It may be the case in some areas that our pressing practical interest is in making predictions. On the other hand, it seems to me one can also perfectly well say that the history of science was in many ways a history of which involved people who were trying to understand the world that we were living in, what's it like, what is our situation on the earth, and so on. And I think that if you take a systematically non-realist view, what this then means is that cosmology and evolutionary theory become useful tools for making predictions, but that you're essentially ruling out them as being able to offer any information about or any challenges to our conception of what the world is like. And that seems to me to be, I mean, we may find that we get into that situation, but I think that throwing in the towel and sort of surrendering in respect of a very reasonable human aspiration. There are other people, and this interrelates to an issue that John was pointing to, who basically have favored non-realist views of science just because they wouldn't want science to be able to pose questions about what they take to be the truth about the world. And I mean, you may be able to offer an argument for that with integrity, but there seems to me to be a something of a danger that what you're doing there is really saying, well, I believe these things to be true, and I will simply avoid anything that might call them into question. And you are also then left, if you take a systematic conventionalist or pragmatist approach, with the fact that we then don't have anything more than the ability to make predictions. We've really got no explanation for how anything is taking place. And I don't see personally why one should lightly give up on that. Ulrich, you're trying to come in on this one, and then I've got Thomas in the queue next.
Exactly. So just very briefly to both Hassan and yourself, Jeremy. So I think it's a very important and valid argument, this thing about explanatory versus predictive. But I would argue that any scientist who is at the state of the art would agree that in order to make decent predictions. Predictions are always difficult in the sense of Popper that you never know whether you have anything that is close to the truth or not. So fundamentally, people are very careful, should be very careful there, and usually are. But the point is, in order to get back to the climate example, if you try to make real predictions, you have to assume that you have an explanatory understanding of the system, right? The other thing that you refer to is something that we would rather call sensitivity studies. If things were as simple as that, how would the envelope for the future look like, right? And so I fully agree that this is a very valid point and argument, but I would say in the sciences, people are already quite advanced, not everybody necessarily, but those who really drive science in a positive way are quite advanced in sort of understanding that you need a proper explanatory understanding of the system in order to get close to reliable predictions even, right? And so in that sense, again, I think I would almost argue that one should, I had argued with Jeremy already in the old, right, when you had your conference and so on, I think it would be so timely to sort of really say, okay, it's very important to look at names, Popper and Ockham and so on, but also to just put critical rationalism to work in practice, right? And while also pondering these fundamental, deep philosophical questions, but not to forget about the problem solving essentially, right?
Okay, I mean, my only worry is that if you've got something that offers a distinctive cut on things, it kind of leads to a lack of interest if all you do is stress the degree to which, in some respects, you're in agreement with everyone else. I mean, that's to say, why? I mean, people might very reasonably then say, well, you know, given you've taken Ulrich's approach on this, and you've stressed the practical agreement about problem solving with you, and you're in many ways not in disagreement on practical matters with the Bayesians, and so on and so on and so on. People might say, well, why should I bother with you at all? Whereas I think it's right not to needlessly stress disagreements. But given that it seems to me that there is something that's a bit distinctive and which typically isn't recognized as such, I mean, someone was, Margareta was asking me, well, why am I giving the lectures? What's the point? And my thought was, well, it's got to a situation now where people who were really interested in critical rationalism are either dead or have got to a point where they don't have students just because they're retired and so on. And so rather than playing computer games or something of this kind, it seemed to me to be well worthwhile to try to articulate something of what this tradition amounted to, and just how on certain points it said things which, at least to me, seemed to be quite interesting and a bit distinctive. Now, okay, I've got now waiting Margareta and then Thomas. Margareta.
Hi, I would like to give Thomas a first opportunity, since I've already asked a question.
Okay,
and I'll
fine.
wait till afterwards.
Okay, Thomas.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, everything is
okay.
fine.
I have just a brief comment a brief reply to Hassan's comment. And I want to point out to the theory of Karl Hempel and Gustav Oppenheim, who say the differentiation of explanation and prediction is just a question of temporality, because explanations happen when the phenomena has already occurred, and then something is explained, and the prediction is the other way around. So we wait until there is that what has been explained. But basically the structure of both is the same.
If I can just stick in on that, it is though worth bearing in mind Popper's argument in his very early 1950s Indeterminism papers that you may be in a situation where you can, after the event, offer explanations which you couldn't in principle offer as predictions, just in the sense that if any prediction that you make is fed back to the system about which you're making predictions, then that may have a disruptive effect. But still, and I think also that if Carlos is still with us, he gave a paper about Hempel and Popper, and basically has argued very strongly that a lot of this stuff should be credited to Popper. But that's getting into complex priority disputes. Thanks very much. Now, Margareta, did anyone want to come back on that, or can we go to Margareta's point?
Actually, yeah. So I end up having a follow-up on this, on what Thomas said, and this is from the strategic management community in response to the economics community. There is a guy, now I forget his name, Kenneth Boulding. Some of you may know him, an economist. And he wrote in a book, and he said, if he knew the content of tomorrow's newspaper, half of it would be empty. And so what this comment, when I started thinking about it, it fits in some way very well with Popper's philosophy, but maybe not completely. That's why I'm here, Jeremy, to help understand myself better what it is. But so what this comment is saying, we create the future and our decisions have intended and unintended consequences. And it's a reference to a paper by Robert Merton about the unanticipated, unintended consequences. And how can we work together to avoid them before we make the decision, with, of course, not spending so much time that we never make the decision. So to me, this brings up the asymmetry between the future and the past. And I think that is what Thomas somehow is pointing out to us. And the problem we have is the religious viewpoints who kind of say the future is already existing. And so whoever adopts the religious views, perspective, that are the people who do nothing at all because they think there's nothing to be done. Well, in reality, we all have the opportunity to be an agent, but we need to understand what our responsibilities are as an agent. And I think that is what Popper is telling, that it's an ethical responsibility that we don't use conventionalism for our personal purposes, but that we try to think as a community that cares for everyone that's a human being, and number 4, and beyond that, to other living beings. But so this, to get back to Dan Popper, I'm talking here about asymmetry between the future that we created and that we use predictions, but we don't use them in the same way as we use them for explanations, just as a way to test how good we understood our own actions and how we made decisions. And that in management, they have like control systems that after the fact you go and you see, did I do what I thought I was doing, or maybe I misunderstood the whole situation. So the reason I bring that up is because I really say we need to think about economic models in a very different way from technological models. And then my question then was actually different. That was for Jeremy, and that was just to ask a little more about aspirational rationalism.
Realism.
Realism, sorry, yes.
Okay. Look, you've raised a lot of points. I mean, I would just say, apropos of your initial point, that it seems to me that newspapers are in effect mostly pretty empty anyway. So on just as a bad joke. More seriously, the Merton stuff, I mean, Popper's Open Society is full of this. Emphasis on unintended consequences is a key theme amongst, for example, the Austrian School of Economics. But in many respects, the key role played by theoretical social science and then the testing of our theories is to try to help us discover ways in which our actions may have unintended consequences and thus modify the actions if they're going to be bad before we actually act on the basis of them. Popper certainly is stressing very strongly the openness of the future. There is a sense, though, in which there are going to be cases where you can say, well, certain things will be consequences of human behavior. Do we have choice about them? Yes. But are we going to make different choices? No. And this, I suspect, is going to be one of the problems that comes up in addressing some of our problems about climatic change. I mean, for example, there are going to be all kinds of things which we are used to with regard to mobility, to having comfortable houses, to having, in some cases, large families or families at all, where someone may be able to say, and may be able to argue quite cogently, well, there are going to be really bad consequences if you act in this way. Is it inevitable that you will? Well, it isn't inevitable, but at the same time, you may well be able to forecast quite realistically that people just aren't going to make the kind of changes to their behavior that would be necessary in order to avoid those things. Finally, on religion. I mean, religious people may say, what is going to happen in the future is known to God. That is quite another thing from saying what's going to happen in the future has been revealed to his would-be prophets, and that it's certainly possible for people to hold religious views without necessarily getting into problems of the kind that you're talking about. Can I see really whether we're now played out with this? No one else is.
Yeah, Jeremy, maybe a few words on aspirational realism.
Yes, this was purely a matter of a term that I was suggesting, but talking about what I take Popper's view to be about realism in connection with the physical sciences and with other sciences. I mean, namely, that we're interested in true, powerful theories about the world, but that in the face of a literature in philosophy where a lot of people have said, well, if you're a scientific realist, you must be saying that our current scientific terms refer, by which they seem to be saying more than that they make some claims about whatever is there. What I wanted to emphasize is that one can be a realist, but combine it with fallibilism and say it is our aim to get such theories, but we don't claim that our existing theories are correct. There are going to be lots of theories which we suspect will be correct, but even they may be things where, in terms of future developments in science, we may find that actually we want to introduce theories which modify considerably what our picture of the world looks like, but where we're still able to save the phenomena, as it were, and also throw greater light upon what the actual structure of the world is. But it's aspirational also, just in the sense that it's not easy. I mean, one of the big issues, I mean, there were various different ones concerning arguments about quantum theory for now, almost 100 years, has been that certain theories seem to be very powerful, but didn't seem to be susceptible of realist alternatives or of realist interpretations. And a lot of people, including Popper and Einstein, but a whole bunch of other people have said, well, this really isn't satisfactory. What we need to do is to try to develop realistic theories. But to date, it's not clear to me that they have been successful in this. I mean, it's become an interesting and rather abstruse field of its own. And I think it's not one where the work has been futile. I mean, a lot of interesting things have come up. But what I'm trying to say is that it's by no means an easy matter to be able to satisfy the hopes of aspirational realism. And there may well be, I've given an example in the area of quantum theory, there may well be many other areas where we can't at the moment see quite what to do. Okay. Well, it's coming up now for almost the 2 hours, so I think I should put you guys out of your misery. I will make the recording available. Only the annoying American voice, apologies to any Americans here, that comes in when I actually make the recording go. I forgot to kick it in, and so the first few minutes of this lecture have not recorded, but I will make available the improved lecture slides to everyone, and also will distribute the material. And next time, we are going to be looking at the problem of the empirical basis. Carlos.
Jeremy, I wonder if next time we can go over again on Popper realism, because I have my own way of interpreting Popper realism, and I will be very happy to share with you and to access some criticism.
Well, why don't you write to me about it? I mean, my reason for saying this is that I have a plan for, all told, 23 lectures, and I also, if there's still anyone left other than my cat, who is participating in these things, I've got plans for a second series. And then also Margareta said to me, well, what about offering a third series concerned with the mind-body problem and the self and its brain? So what I would suggest is that you write to me or send me a paper. I'm very happy to comment on that, as I've had exchanges with other people, and that if it's simply a problem with what I've been saying, I'm happy to sort it out and make a statement to that effect. Otherwise, I would actually suggest that we might consider a symposium at a future conference on it.
Jeremy, let me just second Carlos, because I have a question also for next time or the third course. Everything will be fine. But really, how you see sort of that quantum theory and quantum mechanics would be conflicting or not fully consistent with realism, because again, there also, to me, it's just actually a tool, right? That is the philosophical interpretation of the uncertainty rule and whatever. That's an open philosophical question still, indeed, right? But in principle, to me, quantum mechanics is part of our realistic picture of the world with which we make mobile phones work, right? Well, so that would be interesting.
But there are two things. I mean, one is it a good tool of prediction? And also from that point of view, is it our best theory to date? The second question is, can one actually offer a realistic interpretation of what is going on, where I should stress that matters of realistic interpretation can make a significant difference to the development of physical theory itself. That's to say that I mean, the latter part of Einstein's life in this area was spent motivated in part by dissatisfaction with non-realists, and also there was this issue of non-deterministic aspects to quantum theory. But where I would want to stress to you that this issue is not just one of here is the science and here are a lot of people who are not up to doing the science who get on with philosophical discussions about it. I would see it as being very much that, certainly from a critical rationalist perspective, people, in terms of the ideas that they're working with about what makes for a good or not so good explanation, are in effect working with different philosophical ideas. That if you look at the history of physics, there were clear differences between people who were inspired by ideas about action at a distance and other people who thought that that notion in one way or another was unintelligible, and that this stuff actually influenced the development of physical theory. And this would lead me to say that there is, I think, for exactly this reason, grounds for being rather dissatisfied with the tack that you were wanting to take on these things. If you're asking me, can I say anything intelligent about how this relates to quantum theory? The answer is, I don't know enough about it. Maybe in the last part of the second series of these, assuming that I am still competent to do anything by that point, because time is going on, and the older I am, the less cogent these things are going to be. You might have said, Jeremy, why didn't you give these things as a young man? I mean, and I might indeed say, yes, they probably would have been rather better, but certainly I will put that on the list of, I mean, by way at the very least of Popper's endeavors towards the development of realism in science, and I may be able to say a bit about that in that context.
Jeremy, can I make a very short
yes.
remark? Yeah. Concerning Ulrich, okay, and it seemed to me that you don't have, I mean, I don't understand why physicists or some people are taking Popper's idea of a causally open universe or physically open universe so difficult to understand, because actually if you follow some development in quantum mechanics where the notion of causality or causal explanation or whatever is not really something that you have to accept, mainly in quantum mechanics, then to say that the physical world is causally open, I would say, of course, because the notion of causality now in a statistical indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics is okay with that. So I don't understand why people are criticizing Popper for that.
May I respond very quickly, Carlos?
Yes, but at that point, I'm going to call it a day. Okay, so Ulrich gets the last word on this one.
Okay, well, just a quick thing. From my perspective, it's not that physicists in general or natural scientists have a big problem with Popper. Unfortunately, many of them are not appreciating him and his implications and the implications of critical rationalism enough, and mostly that is because some of them, and I had it recent, I can share with you even documents about that, some of them feel somehow deeply inside a bit offended by not being allowed to do induction. That's what they feel, because many of them are just gathering, making a big stamp collection and dream about inferring from it the final ultimate theory, right? And because so many people like to play this game, they feel offended by being told, well, but that's maybe not quite what you're really doing. So actually, it's more about giving Popper and critical rationalism a better reputation again, which it used to have, but seems to have lost with some people because of some side arguments in a way. I mean, from the physical perspective, not from the philosophical perspective.
We
but anyhow.
clearly need now not me, but a competent advertising agency. But with that somewhat irreverent thought, I will stop. And next time, the empirical basis. Thank you all very much. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you.